Hello, today at Noble Green Wines we're going to be looking at some sparkling wines. We've got three really good examples here of probably the best known areas. There's Prosecco, Cava and Champagne. Now sparkling wine used to start naturally in the winery. What happened is once you've harvested in September and October and you've fermented your wine, the fermentation cools down naturally over the winter and sometimes it's not fully finished fermenting, so you bottle your wine over the winter or in the spring and it can start re-fermenting naturally, which then traps the bubbles in the bottle, which is what we have here. But the problem they had is they were trying to get rid of the bubbles because it caused the bottles to explode. Dom Perignon, who's rightly credited with the invention of champagne, was always trying to get the bubbles out of his sparkling wine to begin with, until he then went on to develop the method of actually making champagne properly as we know it today. There are several ways in which you can make sparkling wine. The first one we'll dispense with quite quickly. It's what the French might call pompe bicyclette. It's basically carbonating the wine, the same as you would with your Coca-Cola. Not very good, it's not something we sell here, so let's move on to something a bit nicer. And that's the tank method, or chamont. And that is where you take your grapes, ferment them in the normal way till they're dry. In this case, it's the Prosecco grape, and it's fermented to about 11%. In the tank, you add yeast and a little bit of cane sugar to it, and it then ferments again in a pressurized tank to create the bubbles. It's then filtered and bottled to create a good sparkling wine without any sediment in it. So let's try the first wine. The region in Treviso, in northern Italy, where this is from, particularly around the towns of Conegliano and Valdobbiadene, is the only area where you're allowed to produce Prosecco. So even though that's the name of the grape, if it's produced from outside that region, it's just Italian sparkling wine, and the grape on the label would be Glera. Not quite so nice sounding, but can be good value. But this is a proper Prosecco from the region. You've got a lovely lemony fruit, a little bit of pear in there, pear drops. Beautiful effervescence. This example here is a Spumante. That means it's fully sparkling. It's about 5 atmospheres pressure. They also specialise in making frizzante, the lightly sparkling wines, which are lovely too. This just happens to be a Spumante, so fully sparkling. Lovely foam on it as well. So on the palate here, lovely lemony fruit, really good acidity, beautiful prickly acidity, as well as the bubbles. Really nice aperitif, lovely with a bit of Parma ham and some manchego. Really nice wine. Moving on to the next wine, here we've got an example of the traditional method, also known as the champagne method. Now here we have grapes that are harvested quite gently. They're usually hand harvested, pressed very gently. They generally only use the free run juice so that you don't get any of those harsh phenolics in there. The example here is made from indigenous grapes to Spain, Jarello, Parellada and Macabeo. You're also allowed to use Chardonnay as well since about the mid-80s, but this is a traditional Cava. It was actually Jose Reventos who went to Champagne in the 1890s and came back wanting to make something like champagne, but with the local varieties with a distinctively Spanish taste to it. So once you've harvested the grapes, press gently, and then they're fermented dry, the same as the Prosecco, to about 11%. But then what happens is they add the liqueur de tirage, which is a little bit of cane sugar, which then sets off a second fermentation in the bottle. A cap's put on so that the CO2 that's produced can't escape. And after about a month, you've got a fully pressurized bottle of young sparkling wine. The next process that happens is that once the yeast has died, you have a little bit of sediment from the dead yeast cells. Now you don't want that in the finished wine, so what they do is they put it in a rack horizontally, and it's gradually turned, a little quarter turn every day as it's gradually turned the right way up. So it starts like this, and it's gradually turned and turned and turned until it's directly pointing downwards. That process is called riddling, and you end up with a little plug of dead yeast cells in the neck of the bottle. That's then dipped into a frozen solution, usually brine solution, to freeze that tiny little plug, The cap's then knocked off in a process called disgorgement. The pressure of the wine releases that little plug, so you've got rid of all the detritus there, and then you add a little bit of liqueur d'expédition, which is the dosage, which determines the sweetness of the wine at the end, because you might want a completely brut wine, so you add a tiny amount of sugar just to balance the acidity. Brut, demi-sec, right through to do a sweet sparkling wine, depending on the level of sweetness that you want. You can even have ultra brut when no dosage is added, but that's a style that's quite tricky to pull off. Very few people can do it effectively because it can just taste quite lean and hollow without a tiny bit of sugar in there to balance the acidity. So let's try this example. It's Cava, Macia. Okay, so you can already see when we're pouring it, there's quite a few more bubbles. That's because this is usually about 6 to 7 atmospheres of pressure, so it's a little bit more than the Prosecco. A little bit more pressure in there. Slightly finer looking bubbles as well. Immediately on the nose, we've got a little bit more yeastiness. There's a bit more than just fruit here. It's a lovely fruit character. Some lemons, a little bit of pear drop again. A little bit of ripeness in there, a little bit of melon perhaps. On the palate, really lovely, a little bit of lime blossom, quite citrusy, quite sharp. Really well balanced though. The dosage in this makes it a brut, but it's got that lovely balance between the acidity and the fruit and the sweetness just on the end of the palate. Really nice wine. Getting back now to the wine in the bottle while the dead yeast cells are still in there before the riddling and the disgorgement. While the wine is left on its lees, it picks up flavour from the lees in a process called yeast autolysis. And that basically means that the wine picks up flavour from the yeast. In the same way you might have Muscadet Soli, it gives it a lovely bready yeasty aroma, but in champagne it's left on for much longer. In the case of non-vintage champagne it's 15 months, and for vintage champagne it's 3 years. Now these are minimums. In practice, good producers leave it for much longer. Bollinger actually make a speciality of recently disgorged, and some others do the same now, Dom Perignon, where they leave it on its lees for extended periods of time. What happens is, because of the enzymes in the yeasts, it preserves the freshness of the wine. So while it's picking up all its flavour, it's also preserving the freshness, which is why a 10-year-old vintage champagne on release still tastes quite youthful. So the yeast autolysis, along with the basic fruit character of the wine and the second fermentation, all contribute to the flavours in the finished champagne. I just want to take a moment actually to show you how I would open a bottle of champagne. There's a lot of cork popping, a lot of noise quite often when champagne's open, but there shouldn't really be any noise. It should just be a gentle hiss. So making sure the cork at no point is pointing anywhere near you. If you hold the cork and twist the bottle, then you've got more control over what's happening than if you try and twist the cork itself, and you should just have a gentle noise like that as it's opened. So this is Champagne Henriot, they're Brut Souverain, which is a lovely family-owned champagne house. They tend to make Chardonnay dominant cuvées. This one is, I think, 60% Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier and 40% Chardonnay. They've got lots of that gorgeous fruit coming through. Lovely lemony character. A little bit of baked apple, a bit of maturity there as well. And on the palate, there's a beautiful taste of brioche. If you think of, a really good patisserie that you're into, the smells and the flavours, that lovely sort of bready aroma, a little bit of red fruit coming in on the finish from the Pinots as well. Really, really gorgeous wine. This is a Brut champagne, which is the standard release of most houses. So you've got a little bit of dosage in there, just to balance out the acidity, because champagne is naturally very, very high in acidity. And then from there, you can go into extra dry, which has a little bit of sugar, more sugar in it, sec, demi-sec, right through to a fully sweet champagne, which you would have with dessert. But this is just what I like, Brut champagne with a little bit of age to it. Fantastic. So we'll see you next time when we'll be looking at some fortified wines.